Okay, so we're getting a successful response from the server. And now what do we want to do with that response? Well, considering that we want to work with that array of apartments, what we actually want to do is for each apartment object in that array, we want to create a new HTML element and append it to the DOM. So how are we going to do that? And this is a time we're going to go back into our documentation to get started. And I'd mentioned the utility methods, so let's go to this area on the left that says utilities. And what we're going to be using here is what is called this each method. And just as we did with the Ajax method, we want to understand what's actually expected by the each method. Well, the first thing that's expecting is an array. What this each method's going to do is iterate over each element in an array and perform code on that. So in this case, that's going to be our callback. We're going to pass in our apartments array. And then what our callback method is going to do is create an HTML element out of that apartment object. So let's go ahead and just have a brief look at the examples. So here's an example with an array here. So in this case, we want to pass in our array of apartment objects, and then we have a callback function. And this callback function is going to work with the index of the array element and the array element value. So I realized that we didn't discuss indexes really. So going back into our code, because we still have the debugger open, let's discuss what the index of an array element actually is. So back here, we know we have our response. And our response in this case is an object. But we don't want the actual object. Our each method is expecting an array. So how do we get the array of apartment objects out of this object here? Well, here's a clue. I told you there were two ways to do it earlier. And the one I said we were going to be using in this case is dot notation. So we have our response. And in order to access this array of apartments, we actually just need to call dot apartments. This is going to return us the value of the apartments key. So as you can see here, now we actually have an array of apartment objects. This is awesome because this is what our first argument in our each method is going to be. And now back to that index. What is that index that it's expecting in our callback? Well, an array is an ordered list. So each element in an array has what's called an index, or its place in that order. And so if we look at our first element here, let's go ahead and see how we would access that. So first step is actually accessing our array, which we know now is response.apartments. And say we wanted to access the first element of that array, we have to access its index. So in this case, let's try doing the first index of this array. Okay, so the element with the index of 1 in our array is actually not what we were expecting. This apartment object here has an ID of 1, and when we passed in that ID here, or for our index 1 in this case, we were returned our apartment object with the ID of 2. So why is that the case? Well, arrays indexes begins at 0. So the first element in an array has an index of 0. So if we wanted to access this element here with the ID of 1, what we're actually going to do is going to pass in the 0 index here. And there we are. We have our object with the ID of 1. So on and so forth. If we wanted to access the second element in the array, we would use that element with the index of 1 and all the way up to 9 here. So while we have 10 objects in our array, it actually only goes up to an index of 9. So I don't necessarily know why this is the case, but this is the nature of arrays. The index of the first element of an array always begins with 0. So going back to our code now, let's go ahead and start working with our each method. So we have our jQuery.each, And then within that, we're going to pass our array, which is a first argument here. And we know our array in this case is response.apartments. That's going to give us those 10 apartment objects. And now we need our callback. So we're going to separate this with a comma. And we're going to pass in our callback function, which is going to work with the index, which we can just refer to as I in this case, and the actual value of the apartment, which we can just refer to as the apartment. This is what we're going to be using to make our HTML element. So now that we're here, why don't we just go ahead and put another debugger statement to see what this apartment actually is. So just as before, we're going to say debugger. And going back into the code here, go ahead and play through this, and then I'm going to refresh it. And it's going to pause at a different place this time. It's going to stop within this each method. So here we are again. And now we've gotten our successful response. And what it's going to do is iterate through each element in our array and give us access to it. So we can see what our apartment actually is. Awesome. So our apartment is this object with all of these properties. So these are the properties that we want to actually use when creating our listing on our page. So now let's create an HTML element that's going to actually utilize these apartment properties.